Hello, everyone. Welcome back, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm Jeremy Collins, the Director of Conferences and Symposia, here at the National World War II Museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. The next session is Was It Really Such a Good War? The Myth and Reality of America's War. To chair this session, it's my pleasure to introduce the founder of the National World War II Museum, Dr. Nick Mueller. Before running and building this museum, Nick was a history professor and served as vice chancellor at the University of New Orleans. During his distinguished career at UNO, Mueller made his mark as a popular teacher, dean, and administrator. He played a lead role in creating the Metropolitan College and in developing new extension and distance learning programs. Dr. Mueller's role as President and CEO Emeritus affords him time for research and writing now, and he published in 2019 Everything We Have, D-Day, 6/6/44, which is a collection of personal accounts from the Allied invasion of Normandy and draws on the museum's collection of oral histories and artifacts. He is currently working on 2 books, including a history of the National World War II Museum. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to pass the session over to Nick.
Thank you, Jeremy. And just one correction, I was not the founder, I was a co-founder along with someone we'll hear more about, I guess, from Elizabeth, my friend, colleague of 32 years, Stephen Ambrose. But thank you all for joining us in the audience for the second day of our program, Memory Wars, World War II at 75, organized and sponsored by the National World War II Museum. 3 years in the making, and we're finally underway. Before we get started on the session today, let me just say a few words about our panelists. You have extensive biographical information on them already and on our program, but just a few words to introduce them as well as what they are going to be talking about. This is especially interesting to me and to the museum here, as one of our panelists, Dr. Elizabeth Samet, professor of English at West Point, attributes much of the responsibility for the good war narrative to my friend and founder of this museum, Stephen Ambrose, along with another friend of our museum, Tom Brokaw, who had hoped to be on this session, but I think she would probably attribute to them as the 2 myth makers in chief in the 90s, perhaps of the good war memory, but we'll let her talk about that. And we thought it would be good to invite her in to discuss and debate her thesis with all of us today and make her case about Brokaw and Ambrose and the myth of the good war narrative. But let me just say at the outset here that first of all, no one at this museum subscribes to the belief that war is good or was good. Any war is good. We do have a position, I would say, that it was better that America and their allies, our allies, won the war, and I think Elizabeth would probably agree with that as well. But there's nothing inherently good about a war in which almost 70 million people were killed, and some 2/3 of them innocent civilians. But new perspectives are always welcome, new research, and as an English professor from West Point, she brings a film and literature and testimonies to the issues of freedom and liberty in her analysis of the contrarian view of World War II from the views of the troops and the populace. We can agree, however, I think, with Dr. Samet that there are many elements of the formation of public memory in our history. And on balance, they are more positive than negative. And that's much of what we're going to talk about. But the origins of the good war, if it is a mythology, as she argues, it has many parents, has been supported by, as she points out, by the media, museums, memorials, public pronouncements, and commemorations over the last 80 years. So we will be debating that. Much of her arguments are laid out in her most recent book, Looking for the Good War, American Amnesia and the Violent Pursuit of Happiness. and getting a lot of attention in major media these days. So many of you probably know her work. She's also written Soldier's Heart, which was very well known, and reading literature through Peace and War at West Point. So I think this will be a very interesting and welcome Dr. Samet. I think she also would like me to offer a disclaimer that her views expressed here today do not reflect any official policy or position of the Department of the Army, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. We also have another distinguished author and panelist who's well known to us for his presentations at our World War II conferences in the past, and today he's beamed in from his home in London, I think, Keith Lowe, whose recent book, Prisoners of History, what monuments to World War II tell us about our history and about ourselves, and that will form the substance of some of his remarks today. Keith is also the author of an international bestseller, A Savage Continent, which tracks some of the themes of Dr. Samet. His Prisoners of History takes a little bit of a different approach, showing how monuments across Europe and America and Asia foster very different views of memory from different nations in the world based on the iconic monuments in those countries. And he will talk about one of them in particular in our own country. There are a lot of questions that he addresses that all of us will think about and talk about. Why we erect them, what stories they tell, who chooses them and why, and do they express something universal and timeless, perhaps something essential about those who have the power to erect them and to flatter the powers that be at the time. This brings me to our third panelist, our own Dr. Michael Bell, a new executive director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. He joined us this past fall from the Defense Department after a 40-year military and civilian service career. He was at the National Defense University. But before that, his military career, he served as an armored officer, retired colonel, served at every level from platoon through theater, army, and faculty at the West Point, as well as the Pentagon and the U.S. Central Command. He was the lead writer for the U.S. National Military Strategy and distinguished graduate there, and later dean of the faculty at the National War College. So in addition to his military service in peace, crisis, and war, he also has a PhD in American history from the University of Maryland and served in the State Department, the White House, and National Security Council. So we do have indeed a distinguished lineup here, and Mike is going to yet take a different approach and going to look at the good war from the perspective of the evolution of U.S. military doctrine, as well as the strategic culture of the military and how the military perceives a good war. It's a very different approach from the others. But together, they're going to offer us a very provocative approach and thought-provoking approach to the origins and the influence of public memory and public policy on decisions of war and peace. Before we get started, let me just say a few words on the good war theme. But before I do that, I should say that each of our panelists will speak as our traditional format for about 15 minutes. We'll have a little roundtable discussion. And after that, we'll open the floor up to our audience, who is out there in cyberspace somewhere. So in any event, let me just say the notion of the good war, or even the critics of the good war, there's nothing really new about that. It was very much alive in the 90s. There was a big flat most of you know about in the audience, as well as our historians. Was one example of the Enola Gay exhibit that was created a great deal of controversy because it looked at the Japanese as victims of an American the atomic bomb and viewed as an atrocity, and they reworked that after a lot of outcry from people who had an opposite view of the atomic bomb, and perhaps Dr. Samet will address that as well as others. But generally speaking, the good war scenario is, we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. We took up the torch of freedom, went to war, totally outnumbered and undermanned at the time, unprepared, defended ourselves against evil racist regimes in Europe and Asia, unified our country on the left and right, and went to the war under the banner of Roosevelt's Four Freedoms to defend liberty, freedom, and democracy against fascist and racist regimes that were bent on our destruction, and that our country was unified as never before. Now, this narrative is strongly criticized by Elizabeth Samet as the outgrowth of a victory culture, a national fantasy that was all myth and has been damaging to our national identity, which, of course, puts it squarely in the position of our national public memory. And she believes, I think, and she'll speak to this, that the myth also inspired a commitment to violence and the use of force in the name of American liberty and democracy. And we will discuss and debate that. And takes on, as I mentioned at the outset, my friend and colleague and founder of this museum, Stephen Ambrose, who believes those American boys were heroes, giants in their time, as Elizabeth says, who knew the difference between right and wrong and were motivated by patriotism and proud of the American troops, and thought that the war, if another author called it the best war ever in a satirical way, Ambrose would never have characterized it that way, nor would Tom Brokaw, writing in a similar vein about the greatest generation. Eisenhower, we all know, also contributed to the good war theme and couched the war even in religious terms. You are about to embark on a great crusade, he said to the troops as they launched their ships and planes and boats to attack the Nazis on the beaches of Normandy. So it's a fact that I think we could agree at least that World War II was a struggle by the Allied nations against totalitarian regimes that were arrayed against us, that had started the war, and we defeated them. I just must say here, we can't, I think every session brings up Ukraine, and I think today's freedom fighters in Ukraine are hailed the world over for fighting to defend freedom and democracy. And so as we look back to the origins of the good war notion, we might want to consider whether or not our boys were fighting for the same thing. I think you're going to hear arguments that maybe they weren't. And whether or not our GIs shared the similar ideals as President Zelensky, who just said yesterday that Ukrainian fighters were fighting for freedom for the whole world. So, and I think much of the world believes that, and I think Tom Brokaw and Stephen Ambrose would clearly resonate with that and think that was similar to the theme that we are going to question here today. So, but as we get going, there are lots of questions. Were we fighting for liberty? And everybody can think about this in the audience and among our speakers. Are we fighting in World War II for freedom and liberty? Were there some more cynical, more practical motivations? Was our nation really all that united? Did the Great War have other origins than the big explosion of, as Dr. Samet says, in the 90s? Were Japanese and the Germans just another enemy? Were the ideals that we fought under, were they important in the training of our troops, or is it just propaganda? Our sacred monuments, do they preserve false memory? Was it a military victory without meaning or any benefits to America and the world? And was the struggle against fascism a fundamental or elemental struggle of the 20th century? It may be back with us again as we speak, as war is breaking out in Central Europe again. And did it matter that human rights were given a new life after World War II? Were our military trained to think about the meaning of why they fought? I think I just will end with this overall statement as we're dealing in the realm of public memory. The famous scholar of memory history, Maurice Halbach, says that collective memory requires the support of a group. In our case here, we would think that group is a society. So does the good war gain credibility from the prevalence of that belief in American society, at least. So memory wars are upon us everywhere. There are deniers of the Holocaust are increasing. We just learned in the last session National Socialism is being normalized, and there is a lot to chew on here on this subject. So, from the perspective of the monuments, I think Keith Lowe is going to lead us off. So, Keith, will you take it away from there, and then we'll come back, and after each of you speak, we will have a little round table, and then let the audience join in, and we'll look forward to that. Keith?
Great. Thanks very much, Nick. Right. And let me just say it's a... hang on a second. I'm going to put some headphones on because I can hear a massive echo. Excuse me for this. Right. I'm so sorry. Okay. Right. So we're here to talk about our memory of the war. And memory comes in all shapes and sizes. I mean, later on in this conference, I believe you're going to be hearing all about museums and the way they remember the war, about films, even about video games. But I want to talk today about monuments, because I think monuments they're a really important part of our landscape of memory. And as we learned in 2020, they can also be really controversial. I mean, lots of statues got torn down that year. Statues of people who used to be considered heroes, but are now considered monsters. That didn't happen to our war memorials. But, just because it didn't happen then, it doesn't mean that it couldn't happen at some point in the future. Because our war memorials are also about heroes. We hold our wartime generations up as knights in shining armor, fighting the good fight against the forces of evil. And that's a problem. Because, no man is perfect. Of course they're not. No society is perfect either. So I'm going to kind of be arguing against this idea of the good war, not because I'm some nasty guy who likes trampling on people's dreams, but because, I care about our memory of the war. I care about keeping it alive. Not a sort of cartoon memory of a sort of battle between good and evil, but a meaningful, nuanced memory. So let's take a look at one of these monuments that I'm going to talk about. If we can get on the screen at some point, the Marine Corps Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. It's one of the best loved monuments in America, and the reason it's so well loved is because it shows Americans as they want to be seen, as heroes. So here we have it. Strictly speaking, I have to say that this is not only a Second World War memorial. It's actually a memorial to all the Marines who've fallen ever since the Corps was first created, back in 1775, I think it was. But, it was built in the aftermath of the war, and it was paid for by donations from Marines who had served during the war. And it's based on one of the most iconic images from 1945. You can see the picture here. Joe Rosenthal's photograph of the moment when a group of Marines raised a flag on Mount Suribachi during the battle for Iwo Jima. Now, to really understand this monument, you have to understand the history behind it. And obviously, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the basic history because we're all familiar with it. Actually, probably lots of people in the audience will be even more familiar with it than I am. But it's important, so I'm going to give you a very brief rundown. As we all know, America's war began 7th of December 1941 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. This was an unbelievable shock to the American system. Some people have said that it was kind of like the 9/11 of its time. I know that Elizabeth will probably have a problem with that comparison, but nevertheless, I think it's important to state the sense of shock that this produced to the American psyche. The American response, well, was not to roll over like the Japanese probably wanted them to, but to fight back. And over the next 3.5 years, Americans clawed their way back step by step across the Pacific. And the Marines were often at the forefront of the action at Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at the Marshall Islands, and so on. The battles they fought were some of the most brutal of the whole war. Japanese soldiers at this time were kind of notorious for their viciousness in battle and their refusal to surrender. And they really inflicted terrible casualties on the Marines who weren't nearly as experienced at this kind of warfare, at the beginning at least. Before long, of course, the Marines then start repaying them in kind, taking few prisoners and occasionally taking revenge on those prisoners that they did take. Atrocities were committed by both sides during the Pacific War, but really because that's just the kind of war it was. I mean, it was a vicious, dirty, unforgiving war. Reports of those atrocities, though, never really made it back home to America because, understandably, the US censor wanted to spare the public the anguish of what was happening to their boys on the front line. But also, I suspect, because they wanted to spare them the shame of what some of their men were doing too. Anyhow, this carried on island by island through to 1945. Eventually, the US forces advanced all the way to the shores of Japan, and the first island they got to was Iwo Jima. And that's where Joe Rosenthal took his famous photograph of the Marines raising their flag on Mount Suribachi. So let's take a closer look at that image. It's a picture of real determination, isn't it? I mean, look at how much effort those men are putting into planting this flag. That's the sort of determination that it takes to fight a 3.5 year battle all the way across the Pacific. And look at the way their hands are all placed along the same flagpole. Their legs are all bent in parallel with one another. I mean, these men they're working together in harmony, aren't they? This is an image of American unity. That's the kind of unity that a nation needs in wartime. But there's also something else going on here. I mean, that flagpole is kind of like a spear, isn't it? It's basically an image of 6 men driving a spike into the belly of the beast. It sort of reminds me of sculptures of St. George killing the dragon, something like that. No Japanese soldiers are actually being killed here, but the force with which they're driving that flag into hostile foreign ground is at least suggestive of something a little bit darker. And finally, it has to be said that this is also an image of vengeance. I mean, the story that begins with Pearl Harbor kind of ends with American troops raising their flag on Japanese soil. This is what happens to anyone who dares attack America. Now, when this monument was first unveiled in November 1954, all of these different meanings of the monument would have been understood instinctively by those who came to the ceremony. 3 of the men who were depicted in that sculpture were actually present at the inauguration, as were the mothers of the other 3, who unfortunately died in battle shortly after Joe Rosenthal took this iconic photograph. All of those people would have had good reason to nurture some of the darker emotions inspired by the monument. But what about the rest of us? What about people who weren't there fighting in the Pacific? What do we see? Well, I suspect that most of us don't even look at what's going on at the sharp end of that flagpole because, we're too busy looking at what's going on up above them because that's where our eyes are drawn. All the men in this sculpture and in the photograph, they sort of form a kind of triangle, and and that sort of draws our eyes upwards, doesn't it, to the flag which is up above them. And then if you look at the guy right at the back, especially in the photograph here, you can see his his hands are stretching out towards the flag, but not quite reaching it. It kind of reminds me of that famous painting of by Michelangelo on the roof of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. You know, the one where you've got Adam reaching up to touch the hand of God, and again, they're not quite touching. So that's the real reason, the real sort of meaning behind this monument. It is about the Marines, of course, and it is about the Second World War, but really, it's about the flag and reaching towards the flag as if it's a higher power. That flag represents everything that's good about America: freedom, justice, hope, democracy. It's almost like a kind of symbol of God himself. This is the very definition of the good war. These are heroes reaching up towards God. So here we get to the crux of the matter. I mean, I love this monument. I think it's an absolutely brilliant image, but it's also really problematic. So this is where I get to list my problems with the monument one by one. First of all, I have to admit that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with all this sort of glorification of the flag. I know this is sort of my problem and I just have to get over myself, but I think it's worth mentioning because it points to a difference in attitude between Americans and Europeans like me. Europe and America learned very different lessons from the Second World War. In Europe, the war taught us the dangers of excessive flag waving, if you like. That was one of the reasons why we went to war in the first place, as far as we're concerned. I certainly can't see a monument like this ever being built in Europe, especially as this is, it's the glorification of a flag being planted into foreign soil. Europeans are very sensitive about this idea, especially, in the years since colonialism. Planting flags in other people's territory is something that we'd like to pretend we never do. In America, of course, things are very different. You don't have nearly so many hang-ups about your flag, I don't think, or maybe you have different hang-ups. Flags are everywhere in America. That's one of the things that's always really struck me when I come to America. You've got flags outside schools, outside people's homes, on your cars. They're everywhere, and that's really amazing for a European like me. I have to say also that Europeans have a very specific reaction to the American flag in particular. Between 1941 and 1945, we were glad to see it coming. Then it meant the same thing to us as it probably does to you. It meant liberation, hope, democracy, freedom. But times change and attitudes change. 5 years after the war, our gratitude to America was starting to wear off. 10 years after the war, we were really over it. And here we are more than 75 years after the war. And when we see the stars and stripes, we don't think of World War II at all. We think about all kinds of other things. Not all of them good, it has to be said. Anyhow, the point is that our attitudes have changed over the years. And this leads me to my second problem about this idea of the good war, because despite the changing times, American attitudes don't really seem to have changed with them. During the Second World War itself, this myth of good and evil was kind of inevitable. We needed it. War, it's about killing people, isn't it? And in order to kill people, you really have to believe that you are good and they are evil. We're not psychopaths, are we? Every war necessarily involves myths of good and evil in some respect or another. But once a war is over, normally these attitudes get toned down a bit. We get to realize that the enemy wasn't universally evil. And also, we did some pretty bad things ourselves, and we start to get a bit more nuanced about things. This is what happened after the First World War. It's arguably what happened after the Vietnam War as well, and after lots of other wars. But it didn't seem to happen after World War II. Now, partly that's because of what we discovered in the concentration camps, sure. Partly it's because, one version of totalitarianism was replaced immediately by another in the Cold War. So we perpetuated these things. But anyway, somehow our attitudes have got ossified. We have quite literally cast them in bronze and put them up on a plinth to worship. So that's my second problem with this idea. I think we've got stuck somehow in 1945. My third problem with the idea of the good war is that it hides a bloodier story. As I've already said, it's hiding in plain sight on this monument. We didn't talk about it then, and we're still not talking about it really today. Britain and America did some really terrible things during the war. We could be using this monument as a way of remembering war as a tragedy. We could be saying, look what the war did to us. It pushed us into impossible situations. It forced us to do uncomfortable things. But that narrative gets silenced because we're too busy congratulating ourselves for being heroes who fought the good fight. My fourth problem with this myth of the good war is that I think it's kind of taught us the wrong things. Once you believe in your society or yourself as being a sort of hero or a saint, you can do no wrong. Every time that Britain and America have gone to war since 1945, we have invoked World War II as a justification. Since we were heroes then, we must still be heroes now, even if Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan are very different from Nazi Germany. I'm not going to bother going into detail about this because I suspect my fellow speakers will have much more to say about it. But suffice it to say that this idea of the good war, it's not a good template for the way that we see our place in the world. My fifth problem with this idea is that I think it's unfair to our veterans, actually. We're constantly telling them that they're heroes. We're constantly calling them the greatest generation. But I never met a veteran who ever thought of himself as a hero. And that's not just because they're being modest. It's because they were there. They know what a real hero looks like. The vast majority of military men are not heroes. They're just ordinary people. Many were cooks and clerks. Many of them were terrified. And, where's the shame in that? And yet we insist on shoving them into this sort of hero-shaped box where there's really not much room to breathe. And that leads me to my final problem with the idea, which is that I think it kind of endangers the very monuments that we say we love. The problem with being a hero or a saint is that it obliges you to be perfect. As soon as you're not perfect anymore, then you're immediately vulnerable. In our myth of the good war, there's only really sort of there's room for two states of being. You're either good or you're evil. If you're not on one side, then you must automatically be on the other. But no soldier's an angel. They make mistakes. They sometimes make the wrong call. Sometimes they act badly, especially in the heat of battle. That's just a part of being human, isn't it? If we instill our children with impossible expectations about what war actually looks like, then we not only make them more likely to go to war in the first place, but we're also setting them up for disappointment, disillusionment. Once they become sufficiently disillusioned with our myths, who's to say that they won't just decide to throw out the whole of our belief system, just like we have started throwing out the belief systems of the Confederates and the colonialists and the slave traders of the 18th and 19th centuries. I'm not saying that our protesters are going to start tearing down the Marine Corps Memorial in the next week or the next year, but maybe in 30 years' time, when a whole new generation is looking at this monument, maybe they'll see something different. Maybe they'll want to tear it down. And if we cling to this idea of the good war, We, the older generations, won't even see it coming. So on that note, I'll leave it there and pass you back to Nick. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Keith. You got us off a good start, and I know Elizabeth will be a good tag team for you. So proceed, Dr. Samet.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to be part of this discussion today. First, I'd like to give you a sense, of course, of the claims to be found in my book, but I think it's helpful at the outset to say what the book is not. It's not a history of World War II. It's not an argument that our participation in that war was unnecessary or unjustified. And it is not an attempt to diminish the cruelty and crimes of the Axis powers or the significance of the Allied victory and the post-war liberal international order. Rather, Looking for the Good War is an investigation into the ways in which our complicated participation in the Second World War, and Keith has suggested some of the ways in which it is complicated, a participation that we must remember was belated and was reactive rather than proactive, has been misremembered and distilled in subsequent decades into the stuff of myth. I think part of the reason for this, the ease with which the myth has taken shape, is that World War II was an aberration in so many ways. The existential threat posed by fascism, the unequivocal necessity of our participation, and the decisiveness of Allied victory, I think, are only the most obvious ways in which this war was different from many others. My book explores the process by which the consequences of Allied victory, and chiefly, I think, the liberation of Europe from Nazi tyranny is what I'm talking about and what is bound up into the myth. That liberation was real and vital. That the consequences of our victory came to be imagined as animating causes of our participation. And I explore the ways in which Americans' celebration of themselves as righteous liberators came to obscure the truth that many Americans, wedded to isolationism, largely ignoring the rise of fascism in the 1930s, some prominent figures even celebrated that rise, Lindbergh among others. The myth omits crucial, compromising details. Our initial reluctance to enter the war on behalf of liberating anyone, our callousness toward the fate of European Jewry, even after the war, in our administration of the displaced person camps, and our exportation of Jim Crow segregation to post-war Europe on army posts and other military installations in particular. The myth likewise overemphasizes home front solidarity, often, and this is especially true in recent years, as a rebuke to underscore or shame our indifference to wars fought today by a small cadre of volunteers, while ignoring the reluctance that survived even Pearl Harbor in some quarters, as well as the diversity of motives, including cynical opportunism, at work among supporters of World War II, as they are of all wars. Only months after Pearl Harbor, it's useful to remember, the government was worried that the public had already lost interest in the war effort, rather than being converted overnight into a belief in its necessity. Moreover, I think the myth exaggerates the economic sacrifices of a country that World War II actually brought back to work for the first time after the Depression, many years. And many Americans suddenly saw more money than they had ever had before. Furthermore, I think this extraordinary instance of American military might leading to the liberation of so many gave rise to a faith that whenever we employ violent force around the world, it will be met with a similar result and with the world's gratitude. And that if it doesn't meet with those results, it's somehow not our fault. The myth turns American violence into a special case, its brutality almost miraculously mitigated by our national temperament. The myth insists that war, at least when it's prosecuted by the United States, is not a tragedy, but a comedy. And I mean that in the rich literary sense of a comedy as a plot that ultimately restores order from chaos, sorts out winners and losers, enlarges the circle of justice, and thereby declares a clear victory. This is a symptom of what the theologian and philosopher Reinhold Niebuhr recognized in the 1950s as an American tendency to regard tragedy, like feudalism and fascism, as European. It also passes over one of the most crucial senses in which I think World War II was unique, its scale and mode of destruction, and Keith has already alluded to this, in the firebombing of German and Japanese cities, and finally, in the explosion of atom bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. War became not simply exceptional destruction, but prospective global annihilation. The myth, which crystallized during the 50th anniversary celebrations in the very artful, seductive narratives of Stephen Ambrose and Tom Brokaw, among many others, and which themselves coincided with the First Gulf War, demands a special kind of amnesia by insisting that everyone has always thought this way about World War II. And in truth, there have been contrarian voices from the start, but we have been reluctant to reckon with the stakes of their critiques. And I'm not talking here about America Firsters and the other isolationists of the period, or of those who continue to think, even after the war, that we would somehow have been better off remaining neutral. Instead, I'm thinking about a collection of thinkers, writers, and artists who seem able to resist the twin seductions of sentimentality and certitude. Those Americans who find in coolness and reason and ambivalence a way of understanding their country. Those who, in short, can tolerate ambiguity. Calling attention to the deep cynicism with which many Americans responded to the war as it was ongoing, the journalist Eric Sevareid remembered in his memoirs all the spendthrifts, bootleggers, and profiteers he encountered in New York and Washington, where he wrote that they danced in nightclubs to what he called the saccharine tune, Remember Pearl Harbor. They complained about sugar rationing or derided the four freedoms and the great vision of the century of the common man as globaloney. Seeing the advertisements proclaiming lucky strikes had gone to war or advising the country that its war production would be increased if everyone masticated a few sticks of Wrigley's per day, that's from Sevareid's book, he confronted the general mood of a nation that, as he wrote, was encouraged to believe that it could produce its way to victory, or buy its victory by the simple measure of writing a check. One 1943 government survey of American enlisted men revealed that only 13% of those surveys could name even 3 of the 4 freedoms. Invocations of World War II have nevertheless acquired a sacral force, the same kind of force that for so many years attached to memories of the Civil War. And the World War II myth has appeals for everyone across the entire political spectrum. It isn't unique to party or faction. The myth flatters our national vanity, shows us at perhaps one of our greatest moments, but our tragic post-war mistake has been in thinking that the consequences of World War II could somehow be endlessly duplicated. And over the years, we've developed a seemingly inexhaustible capacity for surprise when American military might does not establish, as it once helped to do, a new world. 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, invasion, occupation, fitful attempts at nation building, all approached with unbounded and unfounded confidence, have little to show except the waste of lives, treasure, and a great deal of the world's goodwill. It is, I think, a cruel and particular irony that a country, the imagination of which has always been bound up so closely to the future, to the seductive dream of beginning anew, of new opportunities, new chances, future prospects, finds itself today in the position of hoping that history will repeat itself. Keith suggested another way to phrase this, which is that somehow we are trapped in the world of 1945 in certain respects. Myths of the good war have helped to underwrite subsequent conflicts and to market to ourselves and to the world our wars as projects of righteous liberation patterned after World War II. This way of thinking has condemned us to searching for another war just as good. And part of my motivation for writing this book is a belief that we still have a chance to see World War II anew in all its complexity, its ambiguity. By doing so, perhaps we might require a more realistic understanding of the limits of what military force can do, and thus to exert a more rational restraint in its future application. My interest in this is personal as well as professional. World War II was the first war I knew anything about. It was my father's war. He served as an air traffic controller with the Army Air Corps in the Pacific Theater. And it was this war, and not Vietnam, the war with which many of my contemporaries was more familiar, on which I grew up, and through the lens of which I first fashioned my own ideas about war itself. In an important way, then, this book began in the very myths of which I've grown suspicious. In the movies I used to watch, often in my father's company. I was alert to the fact that World War II was being represented as different, special, unique. But it wasn't really until I began working in a military culture that I realized the degree to which some of these myths had shaped my own attitudes toward war in general, or that I recognized the dangers of remembering any war, no matter how just or how necessary, with a haze of sentimental romance. I came to understand that mythologizing war in this way has real human stakes, namely, the lives of my colleagues and students, and everyone else who has been sent to fight in the wars that followed World War II. Myths, as I have suggested, are immensely seductive, and we gain a great deal of strength from them, individually and as a nation. But like all seductions, they demand a surrender of reason. It was Abraham Lincoln, reflecting on the generation that overshadowed his own age, the Iron Men, as he called them, of the Revolution, who recognized that the American experiment was too important to trust to veneration alone. He respected the past without being paralyzed by it. He understood the ways in which the need for progress must temper veneration and hero worship. He realized that only hard and often painful truths could conquer the distortions wrought by myth. And Lincoln also knew that the virtues of one age were not always the ones most required in the present emergency. The damage done by the misremembrance of the war over which Lincoln presided, the lost cause of the Civil War South, is everywhere around us. The damage done by the mythology surrounding World War II, which is only half as old, remains more difficult to disentangle. We're finally beginning to see the extent of the damage done by allowing distortions of Civil War memory to take shape in statue, song, story, monument, and law. We are emerging slowly and painfully from the weight of this memorialization of an earlier conflict. We yet remain enthralled by the romance of World War II. Each generation has found a new use for the good war. Nostalgia for the war years remains a bulwark against doubt and disillusion. It is a great golden age to which we can always retreat to remember who we were, who we might be again, seeking safety through violent conflict, because once we thought we found it there. Retaining a faith in the American capacity for exceptional violence. Victory in the 20th century's second global conflict transformed the world and at the same time transformed the United States. But it also condemned the United States to a futile quest for another war just as good, just as definitive, just as transformational. Wars, even when they respond to an existential threat, never can do the work of redemption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samet, and I think Dr. Bell, you have the floor.
Well, thanks, Nick, and I'll take a slightly different lens, but look at the legacy of the good war in American strategic and military cultures that were shaped, how this idea was shaped during the war and afterwards. Now, certainly, war is the domain of death and destruction, so this concept of a good war really, as the others have noted, should give us cause for concern. The Second World War took an almost inconceivable human toll. Civilian casualties dwarfed military losses, and military losses were indeed significant. American infantry divisions in sustained combat in the European theater averaged 100% losses in their infantry regiments every 3 months. By May 1945, the hardest hit divisions had suffered battle casualties of 176%. No doubt, some will see war and the large-scale taking of human life as not moral. So for them, this concept of good war clearly is not acceptable. On the other hand, while acknowledging the terrible cost for humanity of war, classical realists and those who ascribe to the Western just war tradition might accept that there's such a thing as a good war, particularly when viewed relative to other conflicts. So today I'll examine this persistence of a concept of the Second World War as the good war, really through the lens of culture at two levels: American national strategic culture and American military culture, also known as the American way of war. And the Second World War was a good war with respect to those two aspects of culture, both during the war itself and in the decades that have followed. Now, President John F. Kennedy saw World War II and his wartime experience as incredibly formative. And JFK observed, and I quote, "I firmly believe that as much as I was shaped by anything, so I was shaped by the hand of fate moving in World War II. The war made us. It was and is our single greatest moment." As JFK's comments illustrate, for the people of the United States and for the U.S. Armed Forces, the concept of good war developed and has persisted because it was consistent with and further reinforces American strategic and military cultures. The experience is tied to aspiration and self-characterization. Indeed, the concept continues to resonate because the history and memory of World War II are more consistent with those cultures than any American conflict has been in the last 7 decades. Now, we use a definition, provided by Tom Mencken about strategic culture as a set of shared beliefs, assumptions, modes of behavior derived from common experiences and accepted narratives. Those can be written or oral, that shape our collective identity and relationships to other groups, and which, importantly, determine the appropriate ends and means for securing security objectives. Now, really, what that is it's about national attitudes about the use of military force and how those are impacted by a country's specific geography and resources, history and experiences, society, political structures. Because of that, it's really no surprise that World War II would have a significant impact on American strategic culture. So let me talk about what I see as 3 major tenets in American strategic culture, and significantly how the experience of World War II reinforced or further validated each of those. Now, the first is this idea that war is a deviation from the norm of peace. This reflects the influence of John Locke and the Scottish Enlightenment, the prevailing view that U.S. history can be characterized by long periods of peace punctuated by these generational conflicts, namely the War of 1812, the Civil War, the First World War, World War II. U.S. entry into the Second World War and the subsequent transition of the conflict into a truly global war fit that perception. Now, World War II involved the greatest number of Americans, both in uniform and mobilized, supporting the war effort on the home front in a war that left over 70 million people dead. It certainly was a deviation from the norm of peace. And related to this aspect is the belief that short and decisive wars are best. Such wars get back to the norm of peace fastest. And related to that is, even as the level of violence necessary to achieve that is an important idea. The second of this tenets in strategic culture is this rejection of European power politics. From the colonial era, there was really a sense that the New World constituted a separate sphere. For instance, European monarchies might be at peace with each other in Europe, but raging at war in North America. President James Monroe noted these separate spheres in his famous 1823 doctrine. For Americans, war is not the extension of politics and diplomacy, as Clausewitz asserted. Those are the hallmarks of European power politics. Instead, Americans have tended to see war as the failure of diplomacy. This sense of exceptionalism has influenced the way the U.S. responds to war, deals with others, and perceives and values the contributions of our allies. Now, whether the gains of Hitler in the Sudetenland or the Anschluss with Austria, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Americans viewed the onset of the Second World War as the failure of diplomacy and the politics of isolationism. Americans saw and continue to see a dichotomy between war and diplomacy, placing them in separate spheres. Indeed, U.S. entry into the war, Secretary of State Cordell Hull noted that diplomacy would have to take a backseat to winning the war. Now, the third impulse is this idea in wartime it's necessary to transform the larger system to the service of liberal democratic ideals. For Americans, there's a predilection for waging war for unlimited political aims. Traditionally hesitant to get into wars, once involved, Americans arguably are uncomfortable with wars for limited aims. If a war has to be fought, the argument goes, it should be for transformative purpose, rather than condone any return to the status quo ante. Indeed, for Americans, those generational conflicts in particular often have been defined on moralistic terms, as crusades against good against evil. For example, the Union War aimed after the Emancipation Proclamation to eliminate slavery in the Civil War, or Woodrow Wilson's goal to make the world safe for democracy in World War I. For FDR, U.S. entry into the war after Pearl Harbor provided an opportunity to guarantee the security of the post-war world. Within weeks of U.S. entry into the war, and as a result of his leadership, the U.S., Britain, and 24 other countries signed the Declaration of the United Nations. Contained in that declaration were FDR's 4 freedoms, but importantly, a pledge of all the signatories to support the creation of a post-war organization to maintain peace. In all, 47 countries signed on to the United Nations Declaration during the war, the basis for the wartime Grand Alliance and for the post-war United Nations. So next, let me shift a bit to consider then within this context American military culture, which I would define as an expression of how the nation's military wants to fight its wars. And concerning the U.S. Armed Forces, this is what I would term as the American way of war. The Second World War was the largest undertaking ever by the U.S. Armed Forces. In World War I, the United States had mobilized approximately 4 million men, deploying just under 2 million to France before the armistice 18 months later. In World War II, the United States mobilized 4 times that many and deployed them around the globe in extended campaigns. For the U.S. Armed Forces, the Second World War remains a dominant, if underappreciated, influence on American doctrine and our thinking about war itself. And this shows up in aspects that most might not consider, but official doctrine, unit histories, other areas such as that. Now, given the definition of American military culture focuses on how the military wants to fight its war, particularly something that you find in doctrine, it's useful to point out that conflicts the U.S. military faces may actually be different than what it prefers. And they may require different approaches than the armed forces want or have been trained or equipped for, or even prepared for in their education system. And those then result in a painful period of adaptation or ultimately failure. So I at least want to highlight in American military culture 5 major elements. The number of these we can discuss, but the first is this favoring the direct approach over indirect approaches. General George Marshall advocated for a cross-channel attack, direct in 1942, rather than support Operation Torch in North Africa. In the Pacific, the Navy and the Army Air Corps saw the direct approach against Japan in the Central Pacific as decisive, rather than retaking or liberating American territory in the Philippines, for example. The second element is an industrial approach to war. In World War I, AEF combat divisions were equipped with French artillery. French aircraft were the mainstay of the AEF's fledgling air service. In the Second World War, this changed. With the mobilization that FDR initiated before the war, the United States assumed the role of becoming the great arsenal of democracy, a role that in many ways it sees it continues today. In the war, 2/3 of all Allied military equipment was produced in the United States. This is a staggering 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million trucks, nearly 90,000 landing craft. And these all played out with significant logistic capabilities of U.S. forces that could transport them around the world, deploy them, and of course, feed them. American factories produced 12 million cans of Spam a week. Now, the third, which is related to this, is this industrial approach is a lavish use of firepower. And that's both in the form of artillery and air power. It's become a matter of faith that firepower saves American lives. For American military staffs, it's about synchronizing fires with maneuver, rather than open-ended maneuver to create battlefield opportunities. American artillery is still known as the king of battle. And some of the most poignant memories that German soldiers have of fighting against American soldiers is the devastating artillery they encountered in Normandy or the air attacks when the weather cleared at Bastogne. The fourth, I'll call it an emphasis on technology. World War II witnessed the wholesale mobilization of American science and technology, and in many cases, in a way, thought to effectively counterbalance Axis numerical superiority. And as a result of that wartime experience, the American military have become technological optimists and often seek a warfighting edge through a combination of advanced technology and doctrine. In World War II, this ranged from the Higgins boat, the Norden bomb sight, the Cadillac Traverse in the tank, the P-51 with drop tanks, sonar, napalm, and increasingly depressurized bombers with atomic bombs. And then the fifth, finally, the American way of war focuses on battles rather than on campaigns or strategies. And in so doing, the American way of war tends to conflate targeting, battles, operations, campaigns, and the war itself. Historical treatments tend to focus on battles such as D-Day or the Bulge, and in some cases miss the larger and essential context. Now, for the U.S. military, the experience of the Second World War certainly resulted in a major reorientation. The war fundamentally shaped American military culture and shifted the institutions, really from a force drawn by horses and mules with a pre-war focus on continental defense to a force deployable worldwide with a broad range of global security, deterrence, and warfighting responsibilities. And as such, the experience of the Second World War provides a powerful legacy and leaves an enduring influence on the Department of Defense. Let me briefly just touch on some of the elements of doctrine that we see persisting today coming from this. First is in the phases of the campaign plan and the forms of warfare as they're thought of in DoD. You know, the Joint Publication 1, the Doctrine of the Armed Forces of the United States, lays out that there's two types of warfare. One form is irregular war, which is warfare defined as focused on political outcomes. Now, that would be namely those messy affairs that the U.S. has been involved with since 1945. The other one in Defense Department doctrine is termed traditional war, which involves the military destruction of adversary armed forces, capture the enemy capital, planting the flag on their territory. Traditional war in contemporary DoD doctrine owes a great deal to the Second World War, but curiously, the Defense Department also labels this as the preeminent form of warfare, even though it's certainly been rare in the U.S. experience in the last 7 decades. Now, we see the World War II experience in doctrinal campaign phases as well, reflecting the experience of 1939 to 47. The phases are, deter aggression, respond to aggression, seize the initiative. Of course, phase 3 is the decisive combat phase. And then we move into the post-conflict phase, so-called, with the stabilization and reconstruction activities. Those phases, of course, bear little resemblance to the experiences in Iraq or after 2003 or in Vietnam, but they still become the hallmark of the DoD planning. Now, consistent with an American strategic culture that places military operations and diplomacy in distinct spheres, we see this in our own contingency planning, a concept plan for a major contingency. Only after that is approved at the Department of Defense can the plan be coordinated with other departments and agencies, including with the diplomats. After that plan is approved, then the planners are cleared to coordinate further with allies and partners. And so it becomes very an exclusively military approach to solving the problem. And finally, a particular perspective of the good war is also evident in the use of history by the U.S. military. Armed forces tend to take a very particular view of military histories. I'll offer a few celebrated examples, really from my own experience serving in decades in uniform. As the Army institutionalized its regimental system in the 80s, it adopted a frame consistent with this American way of war. For instance, the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by then Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, is about the exploitation across France and the tank battles with German panzer brigades at Ercourt, the link up with the 101st at Bastogne. This is the liberation of France, not the subsequent occupation of Germany or the liberation of the concentration camps. For the 1st Division, the Big Red One, it's about D-Day. It's not about the costly, longer-term and learning experiences in North Africa or Sicily. The 24th Division was about Pearl Harbor, not Hollandia or the liberation of the Philippines in conjunction with guerrilla forces or occupation duty in Japan. So how do we bring out that larger context in addition to those stories as well? A danger for American doctrine and future military operations is that A character is developed that over time may come to ignore many aspects of the war experience. The importance of allies, to include their centrality in strategic planning, coalition warfare, and theater campaigns. The need for mobilization of personnel, industry, and sectors such as agriculture, medicine, and science. The role and contribution of local guerrilla insurgent movements, whether in the Philippines or France, Italy, and the Balkans. Our need to link war aims to campaign objectives, and the centrality of civilian direction and control of the military, as in FDR's case. And finally, the importance of occupation duties in developing responsible post-war societies and governments in Germany and Japan. None of these can be ignored. Our task is to incorporate them, and here at the museum, we take those seriously and try to bring those in. Nevertheless, for the U.S. military, the Second World War is likely to remain the good war. It has reinforced American strategic culture and perspectives, shaped how our armed forces hope to fight the next war, as reflected in both formal and informal doctrine, and providing an enduring frame of reference, shaping historical perspectives about warfare, about military operations, and views of and aspirations for the military perspective. So thank you very much. I look forward to the questions.
All right, then. Well, we've certainly gotten a diverse set of views, and perhaps we could just, I'd like to say at least we all believe, I think that, as Carol Gluck once said, good history leads to good memory. And I think we all interested in that approach. And perhaps an opening question might be for Elizabeth or Keith to respond to a very different approach to good war and different sources and implications for it in the American military. And Elizabeth, you might be the best one to begin, because as a professor at West Point, might have some reactions to Mike's argument.
Well, I actually see the arguments as complementary in many ways, in that Mike provides the doctrinal and sort of practical repercussions of thinking about a war in a particular way. I'm obviously focused instead on the cultural and artistic and popular reimaginings of the war. But I think that the idea that myths have practical consequences is nowhere more clearly articulated than in a study of doctrine and of tactics and strategy and of the way those of military organizations change as a result of what we focus on and the lessons we learn from a previous war.
And so you would think that the case Mike is making then is an extension of your argument and needs some correction. I'm not sure where you ended up there.
Well, I don't think it's an extension. I think it's a different line of inquiry. But he shows really quite comprehensively the ways in which an institution remembers a particular conflict. The select lessons learned help to shape structure, organization, the way wars are fought in the future. So I think it's, we're talking about very different things, but we're talking about different outgrowths of the conflict of the Second World War.
Keith, or would you all like to ask each other a question? I have some of my own, but we'll let you all go ahead.
Well, I'd just like to add to what Elizabeth said, and say that, in some ways we always fight the last war, don't we, rather than the one we're supposed to be fighting now. And even during the Second World War, there were accusations that the British, for example, were refighting the war as if it were World War One, and had to relearn the lessons that you shouldn't be doing that. There were new things they should be facing. And so, what Mike is saying is we're still fighting the Second World War all over again, repeatedly, rather than actually learning from that and moving on into thinking of things in new terms, and terms that are more relevant to today. So, yeah, that's all I wanted to add.
All right, but what would you say about that, Mike?
Yeah, if I could add to it, I think one of the challenges I see is that, the World War II can be quite illustrative, but if we only focus on the very traditional aspects, those may not be as relevant. And some of the larger contexts that we've ignored, the theaters that don't get much mention, for example, in the Philippines or China, Burma, India, the war is much different than in some cases the kind of doctrinal memory or the unit history kind of lays out. And so I think there's huge lessons to be learned. There's incredible relevance because this is kind of human interaction on a massive scale that really in many ways can be relevant today. But I think if we take a very narrow view, we may do so at our peril.
Well, would you say that the evolution of the strategic culture in the military and the doctrinal advances that you described that were influenced, theoretically, you might say they were good. I'm not saying the war was good, but those influences have been positive over the long haul. Or would you be critical of the evolution of that influence from World War II on the strategic culture and the doctrinal developments?
So Nick, I'd be a little more critical in the doctrinal realm, because in some ways I think the military struggles to try to apply this traditional lens derived from a particular view of World War II to many of the conflicts after the war. So whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan or and not actually learning the lessons, how difficult comprehensive state building is, for example, as you approach the challenge in Iraq or Afghanistan, and instead we sometimes take away kind of simplistic views of the war without actually understanding the larger context.
Elizabeth, I think you were trying to say something a minute ago, and I went to Mike, or did I misread that? Okay. Well, let me ask. I mean, there's a question about the overall mythology of the good war, and it's I guess Keith and Elizabeth would share a belief that it's been damaging to the formation of a better memory or a better narrative, so Elizabeth, could you describe what the alternative narrative of World War II would be for us today, if we can assume for a moment that the good war is as pervasive as you say it is, and there are some that would maybe strike a middle zone for that, but why don't you tell us how you would teach America about the war and its legacies and what we learned from it, and as alternative to what you think is the prevailing myth of the war?
Well, I think part of the idea here is not that I would replace one story with an alternate story that is just as neat. The idea is that I would like to complicate the story, and that to say that there were to attempt to say that it was either good or bad, this desire, this focus on goodness and greatness, seems to me counterproductive. That there are ways of studying history, there are ways of studying culture that don't always resolve themselves into that sort of evaluation. And I'm not sure why we always need to end up there. I think we can acknowledge the significance of the Allied victory in World War II. We can acknowledge that liberation, which is one of the fundamental strains of the myth, was an essential part of that. And then think about the world that we were left with. And think about the ways in which the world of 1945 is not the world of today. And Keith alluded to that, and maybe he'll say more about that. But that we are, in a sense, imprisoned by the good and evil that he talked about, by a sort of Manichaean view of the world, which resolves everyone into good and bad. And I don't think that that's an accurate reflection of people's motives, of their reasons for going to war in the first place. And I'm not sure that it helps us to evaluate the world situation in the complex and nuanced way that it demands. Not every conflict looks like World War II or will look like World War II. And our own image of World War II has, because it flatters us, has resolved itself into, I think, a dominant strain, let's say, of the myth. It predated the 50th anniversary celebrations, just as the skepticism about the war predated. And I use as one of the epigraphs to my book Studs Terkel's note to his magnificent collection of interviews about those who experienced World War II, either in theaters, combat theaters, or on the home front. And he calls his book, this subsequent collection of the transcripts, The Good War. And he has a note in which he says quotation marks have been added, not as a matter of caprice or editorial comment, but simply because the adjective good mated to the war, to the noun war, is so incongruous. And that's Terkel writing in 1984 during the 40th anniversary commemorations of World War II. And his book offers a rich, polyvocal account of what the war was, full of contradiction, full of every kind of response imaginable and uncensored. And I think that that rich, nuanced, often contradictory history, often ambiguous history, is the one that will serve us the best, because it is the most complicated, it is the most difficult, but I think it's that kind of attitude toward the complexities of the world that will, in fact, sustain us in the future.
Well, I think we could have a whole conference just on this one session here, but let me just ask Elizabeth too. With regard to your methodology, on the one hand, I mean, you just talked about Studs Terkel, and you say in your introduction that you're especially concerned with those observers that express doubt or confusion, ask questions, and otherwise complicate our picture of the war. I mean, that's what you just said. And I mean, do you think this is a balanced approach? I mean, here at the National World War II Museum, we have some 12,000 oral histories of World War II veterans, the largest first-person accounts probably in the world. And might look at, if you're looking for one type of individual that you say you're concerned with and not looking for the alternatives, you're going to find the answer that you want instead of what might be based on a more balanced methodology of looking at a larger variety in a systematic way. I mean, how would you respond to that?
Well, I include memoirs, I include nonfiction and fiction, I include accounts nearly contemporaneous with the war, and then I include subsequent accounts because memory changes. The way we reflect on a cataclysmic event in its midst or soon after changes as we go along. I tried to include as expansive a collection of voices as I possibly could. It was not, as I said, a history of the war, but a history of the way in which that war was remembered. And so I certainly do talk about the full range of remembrance. That was my hope. But I do think that we tend to ignore the more complicated accounts that fall in the middle. So if we have the myth of the good war on the one hand, and we have the conspiracy theorists and the deniers and the revisionists on the other, in the middle, people who try to incorporate as much nuance as possible, those are the people that I think are most interesting and might yield the richest kind of counterpoint to an oversimplification, either on one hand or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I've read. I know you look at a whole range of sources and memoirs and testimonies. I just was calling attention to ask really the question about. You say yourself you're really looking for those individuals, observers who express doubt or confusion or complicate the picture of the war, and that's the focus of the people that you were really studying in the basis for your conclusion. So, but in any event, go ahead.
Well, I think they offer us the best hope of understanding the war in all its complexity.
Okay, fair enough. And Keith, you want to add to that, or Mike? I think we're getting ready to open this up to our viewers out there.
Yeah, I mean, I would. I mean, that's the reason why I chose to write about monuments, because, you know, if you're looking at lots of different sources, then of course it's possible to have a wide range of opinions and so on about the war. But the problem with a monument is you've got to boil everything down into a single image, haven't you? So, those images around the world are very different, and they tell of quite a specific story. So, in America, and in Britain as well, we do the same thing. We focus very much on the heroes. But if you go to places in Europe, and usually they focus much more on the victims of the war, the sort of martyrs of the war, and that has other dangers. If you're concentrating on only one aspect, uh, there's always going to be it's always going to be problematic. So I agree with Elizabeth that actually what we need to do is not just focus on the heroes or focus on the martyrs. Or in Germany, and they focus on the discomfort of being the sort of monsters of the war. What we should have is a little bit of all of it, so that we make a much more nuanced view of the whole spectrum of the way that the war can be remembered.
Well, and the only thing I would say is that I think there is a vast amount of literature and history and presented here in this museum, talking about Japanese American concentration, like incarceration camps. You're talking about the racism palpable in our own country, and there have been a host of books addressing this for many years. Before we turn it over to the audience, let me just bring up an arresting quote that appeared in the Catch-22 after a few months after the hardcover came out, in a letter to Heller he received, and the quote says, "For 16 years," and this was in the introduction to the book, but Heller received this letter. And the writer says, "For 16 years, I've been waiting for a great anti-war book, which I knew World War II must produce. I rather doubted, however, that it would come out of America. I would have guessed Germany. I am happy to have been wrong. Thank you." The writer was Stephen Ambrose. Imagine that. All right.
Well, thank
Jeremy?
you, panelists. We have a number of questions, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. First one from Sean B. Why is there such long-term apathy and/or resistance to honestly confronting Allied war crimes in World War II? I guess I would look to Elizabeth first to see if she gets into that in looking for the good war, and then we could perhaps pass it to Mike or Keith.
Well, I guess I would say in response to that is the aspect of the war that we have with the mythology. It's not a complicated answer as far as I'm concerned. I do think we have gotten to those crimes in somewhat more detail, and historians have done this all along, as has been pointed out by Nick and others. But I think that part of the problem is that these things, it appears that these things have to be rediscovered and re-examined all the time because we are so resistant to incorporating these aspects of the war into the larger picture.
Thank you. Our next question is going to be from Sarah. Is there a difference in the American consciousness of the good war between the different theaters of the war? And Keith, since you spoke on the Iwo Jima Memorial, did you find any comparisons in Europe, or is there a ETO-PTO comparison contrast?
Well, I mean, really, I think our memories of the European war override our memories of what happened in Asia. We remember the liberation of the concentration camps is so stark in the way we remember things that that sort of image of Nazi evil really it's taken over our memory in a lot of ways. Lots of the things the Japanese did were just as bad. Unit 731, vivisection of human beings, and so on, bacteriological warfare. But we don't really remember that quite as much. If you think of an archetype of evil, the archetype we have in our head is always wearing a Nazi helmet. It's not a Japanese helmet. So yes, there is a difference between the way we remember the war, and it was different. The way we treated the occupied countries as well in the aftermath of the Second World War was very different. In Germany, Americans, and especially Americans, but also British, were quite harsh towards the Germans. They wanted proper justice, revenge, even in some respects. Whereas in Japan, we were much more lenient. MacArthur was incredibly lenient compared when dealing with the Japanese. So there is a definite difference in quality in the way, both the way that things were dealt with at the time and the way we remember it.
Thank you, Keith. I'm going to make this next one sort of a lightning round. Can any of our panelists speak about popular histories, TV, books, podcasts, and how they perpetuate these mythologies? I'm going to start with Mike and see if he's got a book or a movie that he would say is a perpetrator of expanding mythology, then Elizabeth, and then Keith.
I'm going to have to take a bye on that one, Jeremy. I'm I'm probably not up on popular culture and TV on that. Can go to the others and
Elizabeth,
and then we'll
please.
reattack.
Sure. There are many examples. I'm going to choose one that's maybe slightly more subtle than some of those others, and it's the transformation of the Army uniform to something that echoes the World War II uniform. It's very close to the old uniform, and they've revived everything, including the Ike jacket. And I think that sort of nostalgia for a time of comparative clarity is indicative of the ways in which the mythology and the lingering influence of that particular incarnation of the armed forces and the country holds over to today.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Keith?
Yeah, I mean, I can't let this go without mentioning Saving Private Ryan. Of course not. There you have, people going to save this guy because of some wonderful sort of sentimental idea of you've got to save the last guy in the family and so on. That's not why we went to the war. It's also something which is very sensitive here in Britain because, of course, it's D-Day as the Americans won it, when actually, two of the beaches were landed on by the British and another one by Canadians. So, three-fifths of D-Day was not American. So, but that's still how we remember it. Even in Britain, we still remember it as an American operation.
Well, let me just respond to that too, Keith. When I first went to the Portsmouth Museum, I didn't see very much about the Yanks in there. So, so back at you. And I would also want to say that you're focusing on the ending of Private Ryan, and I think if there's any film in the end of the 20th century that did more to try to focus on the violence and the ugly side of the war, as Kirk Sadowski said yesterday in the session on film, when that ramp dropped down and the next 23 minutes took place cinematically, I don't think anybody thinks there's anything good about the good war there. They also showed Americans killing unarmed Germans. And there's an awful lot in Saving Private Ryan that runs counter to the arguments that America has never looked at the seamy underside or the darker side of World War II. We certainly do here at the National World War II Museum. We look at both sides, but of those instances. But I don't think you can just use a Saving Private Ryan just to illustrate that one point because of the ending. But if you see veterans in that cemetery, there's a lot of reactions by the older veterans, and we're not seeing it much more anymore, but there has been for the last 30 years that I've been going there, that very similar reaction that has a ring of authenticity to it. For whatever reasons, it's hard to criticize their emotions and their reactions when they're standing there in front of the graves of their friends.
Well, I think we can have a Refighting the Good War as the next book by one of our esteemed panelists. We do need to wrap up the session so that we can stay on schedule, but I'd like to thank very much the chair, Dr. Nick Mueller. Of course, our friend Keith Lowe, who has taken many Americans on our overseas battlefield tours to many of these monuments and sites of memory. as well as Dr. Elizabeth Samet. Thank you very much for joining this program, ma'am. It's a very important book that a lot of folks have been talking about here for the past few months, and not just here at the museum, but beyond. And of course, Dr. Michael Bell for bringing his unique insights from his decades of service to our country, but also as a PhD from the University of Maryland. So great session, great speakers, and great questions from the audience.